All right, there's that all familiar song that you hear every time I do my podcast. And even though this is the new and improved Unapologetic Descriptor for Good podcast, it is the same music that you have heard literally hundreds of times. So welcome to the Unapologetic Descriptor for Good podcast. I am Matthew, your host, and I am so excited about jumping back into the podcast. Let me tell you, I just looked it up, and we just passed 265,000 streams in over 100 countries. And a shout out to my good people, the Aussies and the Kiwis in Australia and New Zealand, for always being right there at the top for listening. I have appreciated you all and have really enjoyed being able to come and talk to you in person, even just last October. So shout out to you all for constantly supporting us, supporting this show, supporting this movement around understanding the impacts of trauma on the daily lives of all of us, and especially within the field of education. So shout out to you all. And for all the US listeners, you are always at the top because, you know, there's a lot of us around here. But I really appreciate you all listening as well and trying to give you new content that connects to your heart, your mind, and your soul, and pushes the work that you do on a daily basis. Because you all know I am a principal every single day. Was today, just about 2 hours ago, actually. And people say, man, I can't believe you doing the podcast and you're back to being a principal. I tell people, this is how my bucket is filled. I talk to brilliant, remarkable people and fill my bucket of knowledge and understanding and keep my North Star of why I continue to do what I do for myself, for the staff that I work with, and for the kids and the families and the communities that we see every day. So welcome back. Welcome to the podcast. And I cannot wait for you to hear from today's guest. This is going to be incredible. I have Kalin on today, and she's a registered clinical counselor and a certified EMDR therapist and a mental performance specialist. She's widely recognized for her work integrating mental health support with high performance in both professional and athletic spaces. With her roots as a national level athlete and a coach for the Canadian national team, Kara has spent over 2 decades at the intersection of psychological resilience and peak performance. She has worked extensively with frontline workers, corporate professionals, and elite athletes, helping them manage stress, recover from trauma, and optimize their mental well-being. Kara's distinctive approach blends her deep understanding of mental fortitude with the transformative power of EMDR therapy. Her extensive training and experience in EMDR have solidified her reputation as a leader in mental wellness and fueled it with her commitment to pioneering its application beyond traditional therapy settings. Having successfully supported frontline workers, athletes, and high-performance professionals, through EMDR therapy in her private practice, Kara envisioned an online platform to expand this supportive nationwide. Shift Change is that vision in action, a revolutionary approach to providing an on-demand mental health support for those who need it most, whether after high-stakes shifts or high-pressure performance. So welcome, Kara. So glad you're here. I just read a massive bio, which we talked earlier. There's nothing better than hearing a story about you while you're in the room. But tell us a little bit more about you, and welcome to the Unapologetic Disruptor for Good podcast.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, my story is, I feel like it has many chapters, but you know, basically I grew up in sport and a sport family, and spent, you know, most of my young life as a synchronized swimmer. It's formerly synchronized swimming. Now it's called artistic swimming. That's where you are underwater and you're throwing people up in the air and doing really cool things. And of course, I believe it's one of the hardest sports there is that exists. So, you know, I started my life there. And from that 16, 17-year-old became a coach. And really with the intention when I left sport was to, I wanted to be a coach that was different than the coaches that I had. When I go back and think about every sort of transition point of my life, it was always, I wanted to do the thing better than I experienced. And so I spent many years wearing the role of the hat of synchronized swimming coach. eventually moved to BC and thought I would just continue coaching while I went to school and did my undergrad and my grad school. And so I sort of straddled these two worlds, of one world being what I call living through suppression culture, because really that's what sport for me in the 90s was about. It's just pushing through, gritting through anything that's difficult. You just outthink it. And, had a lot of training and practice to do it that way. And then once I enter into the world of getting a master's degree in counseling, I wrote my thesis on how do we bring those counseling practices and, this idea of mindfulness and therapy into sport, because, my experience of being in sport was so, it was so harsh that as I started to learn about empathy and compassion, it was like such a foreign thing to me that I can remember sitting in the counseling room practicing being empathetic with a colleague and thinking it was the most ridiculous thing I've ever had to do, so I spent most of my life up until 2018 wearing many hats. And really, because I was, what I know now was out in the world trying to prove myself to everybody. And in 2018, I decided that I was going to leave sport. I spent a lot of time trying to change the system in which I worked. When I couldn't bring change as a coach, I tried to, get hired as a technical director. I tried to engage myself into leadership positions. And, we talked about, the name of this podcast, Unapologetic Disruptor. I was in a system trying to bring change, and I was hit with blocks every which way I tried to turn. And so it didn't really matter what I did. There was resistance against that. And so I didn't know that my journey was to leave sport, but there was this, defining moment where my supervisor, who had hired me at the time, she said to me, "Kara, do you want your children to believe that this is more important than them?" And I remember just unraveling in that moment. And that, was the beginning of me really taking a hard look at the spaces and the places that I was putting myself in. And so I transitioned out of sport. I made that decision. I gave up this dream of being a coach at the Olympics. I really wanted to do that. I really wanted to be a part of doing it in a different kind of way than what had been done. And so, it wasn't like I gave up the dream of going to the Olympics, but I decided I'm going to get there in a different way. So the way is not going to be the way I imagine it to be, but like, I'm still going. That's still like here. It's still like a dream that's alive and well, but I'm not going to wear the hat of the coach. I'm not going to. And so then I got pregnant in 2019. I already had 2 children. And so talk about, being a mother, working in all levels of sport, in the provincial organization, national organization, running a club. And then I was working in private practice. I had 2 kids. And then I got pregnant with twins in 2019, and it literally took me out. And so that experience was one that I was reflecting on today, because a really close friend of mine, it's her birthday. And I got to the end of this twin pregnancy, which was an immense amount of suffering. I was very, very ill and still had 2 children under the age of 3. So I had no choice but to continue to keep moving. Like, there was no option for me. And we got to the end of the 37 weeks. I had taken these twins to full term, and my OB at the time wanted to induce me. And I felt so much guilt about it. I was like, no, they're supposed to come when they're supposed to come. I was like, no, we can't do that. And, my friend Katie, she said to me, nobody is going to give you a medal for suffering the longest. Like, nobody's going to do that for you. So what are you doing? Like, the last 5 months, I was sleeping in a bathtub because I was in so much pain. And so I kind of remembered that this morning as like this surrender moment to just like, you got to put the mask on yourself, Kara. Like, this is the moment. But even in all of that, I still was holding so tight. And so I gave birth to these twins right in the middle of the pandemic. So we had just gone into lockdown in Canada. So, parks are closed, everything's closed. I have not a lot of support that lives around me. So it was like full on, survival, like real survival. And there was this moment where I started to feel the fog of postpartum coming in. And I think that I probably had postpartum with my other two, but when you're busy and you're not thinking about it, you just powering through life, I just somehow, managed to avoid the fog of that somehow. But this cloud's coming in, and I reach out to go see a postpartum therapist, and I sat on her couch. That was the moment she introduced me to Tara Brock, my first sort of understanding of like, what is compassion? How do we have compassion? How do we actually do that and feel that? And so I always tell the story of, I had left that appointment, gone to Nordstrom's as I had done that was my form of coping, shop, like go shop your way out of this sadness. Right. And I had come onto the corner of the street, and I stepped out there, and because we were still in COVID, like I saw all the suffering on the street. And where I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, we have a lot of folks who are living on the street. It's really warm here. And so there was so much suffering. And I remember leaving, and I had my first panic attack that I ever had in my life, because the thought was, if I'm this unwell, how can I be a helper in all of that when I'm here at the bottom of it? And so, I still had this like kind of doing thing going for me. And so rather than sitting with the darkness that was coming in, I enrolled in EMDR therapy. I was like, well, I'm just going to get trained in something because my brain needs to not feel so terrible, and I need to not feel like I'm in survival. So I'm just going to go enroll in a course because that's going to help me. That was my thinking at the time. And it was in that EMDR therapy that we had to practice with a partner. And I was taken back to an 11-year-old sport trauma that I had experienced that I thought I was over. It was not something that I ever thought about. But when I was taken back there, what I saw was what I say, the seed of not good enough was planted. And where I saw 2 decades of my life of all of these faces that flash of who I was trying to prove myself to. And I remember I was so destabilized because everything I knew was just like there for me to look at. And so I think that, the universe was saying, hey, girl, you're not listening. So we're going to just put this right here for you. So I'm in the middle of doing this training. Now I have to hire an EMDR therapist because I've now found this seed. And I spend 2 weeks of doing some intensive clearing with these seeds. And really saw that the majority of my life was all about repression of every hard moment I'd ever been in, and that it was sitting in there waiting for me to come and attend to it. But I never had the time or the space. And of course, what better time than in COVID with 4 kids? Like, I mean, come on.
Exactly.
So once I got trained and the same breath was experiencing the healing from EMDR, I was just like, my mind was blown. I thought, how on earth are people walking around, A, not knowing these things are operating in the background, B, having no idea about this modality? Because if I shared it with people, they were like, huh, EM what? They didn't know what you're talking about. And so I decided as a practitioner, I was no longer going to do talk therapy, that I was only going to do EMDR in my practice. I completely tried, like literally overnight. Wow. And all my clients were like, all right, like, we had already built this rapport, and I just was, and I shared myself. It was, when we come into the world of being therapists, and there's all these things about like ethics and don't share your life with anyone and be really sterile. And I was like, listen, part of what helps people to feel like they can come and sit with me is that they know that I'm not just someone reading from a textbook that's saying, hey, this thing's going to help you, but I'm not going to try it on. Like, that's just not who I wanted to be in the world. And so I would, when it was appropriate, would share different parts of my journey and my story, and people would go, okay. And so little bit by little bit, and, flash forward now, it's the only thing that I do. But in that process, there was all these sort of what I feel like synchronistic moments where I was continuing to be guided from doing EMDR therapy, I got a contract with an organization to come and help build resiliency with their people. And what I discovered was that their people, it wasn't about their resiliency. It was about the fact that they were being vicariously traumatized in their jobs. And I thought, okay, well, there's only one of me and there's all these people. How do I bring healing to this group now? So then I discovered that there's group protocols in EMDR. I go out and get trained in all of them and learn, actually, in the United States, like after mass shootings, that Dr. Nacho Hiro and the humanitarian people that work with him, they go into gymnasiums and help clear these traumas from happening. And when I learned about that, I was like, holy crap, that's incredible. Like there's people doing this. So then I had the opportunity to start bringing this group protocol into corporate spaces, and I started to see the impact of it. And so that led to the next thing and led to the next thing. And, you know, last March, I hired a business coach because I thought, I don't know where to take this. Like when I would sit down by myself and look at all the different spaces where people are experiencing vicarious trauma, it's endless, really. When you understand what is vicarious trauma, anyone who watches the news experiences vicarious trauma. Anyone that has a phone that scrolls on it is going to be exposed to something that's going to be, you know, have something that's going to imprint in the brain or in the nervous system in some kind of a way. And so Shift Change was birthed about a year ago. And the dream of the name really was that every human who is in a position where they experience vicarious trauma, that they would be able to use this protocol before they go home to their families. And what I started to learn in myself, but also in the world, is that you have all these people who are helpers, who are healers, who go into spaces where they are the capable human. They know how to be in that space and help those people. And part of why that is because, you know, somewhere along the way, they were told that they were great at that thing. But when I started to think about myself, I never asked for help. I never waved the flag. I never said this is too much or that's too much. I never, you know, sat down and told people like I can't travel to a competition because I just birthed a baby. Like I literally gave birth to my second son and showed up to the pool 3 days later. He was on an airplane with me when he was 3 weeks old. Like it's a wild thing that asking for help was something I actually did not know how to do.
You know, and I think that's culturally, you know, I'm a documentary fiend. I love documentaries. I just watched one, I think it's called The Top 5 or something. It's followed 5 NBA players, right? And I've noticed a major shift where they now talk about things like this, where back when I followed Michael Jordan and even Kobe, those things were really weren't talked about. And I think I grew up in the 90s. I graduated in 1995. And I remember the pull yourself up by your bootstraps and don't talk about things and those feelings and all of that. And I think that it was a cultural thing, not just in the United States, but everywhere. There was so much of, we just didn't know better. We did what we knew. Now we know better. We do better. But unfortunately, there are people in every aspect of every field, whether education, business, whatever, sports, that still have that mindset. And matter of fact, my last guest that was here, Martin Sims, we talked about Bobby Knight, who was the coach of Indiana. He was notorious for mistreating his team, even throwing chairs at them, right? That was like normalized back then, that we're in a different space because we have new information. Another thing it made me think of, have you ever watched Shrinking? Because you just described what happens in Shrinking. It is it's amazing. It's a I don't want to get any sponsors, by the way, from Shrinking. It is it's a sitcom about therapists and how one overshares his personal story to all of his clients. So it made me think of that made me laugh. But then lastly, what you just described to a dear friend of mine, his name is Caleb Campbell. He was an ex-NFL player and a West Point graduate from the military academy. Went to the NFL and had the epiphany you just described. And I think this is common with high-performing anyone's, right? Whether it's athletics, whatever it is, academics, is this idea that I'm really good at this. I'm going to push through it. I have things that other people don't have. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute. He had the same epiphany. He walked into a mental health wall, got literally and metaphorically hit, and was like, what am I doing? I'm trying to live up to a standard that was set on me when I was a little child.
Totally.
And he has gone through this same journey. I can't honestly remember if he's even been on this podcast, but a lot of people experience this. And when you work with people, you work with frontline people, right? Is what you say in your bio and the work you do. Talk a little bit more about frontline. You probably have heard me on the podcast talk about educators are frontline workers now. And I mean, I truly believe this for 1,000 different reasons. But tell me a little bit more about when you say frontline, what do you mean?
Yeah. Well, initially when I was seeing people in the pandemic, right? We in BC, we used to have this hour where we would all go outside and cheer for our healthcare heroes. You know, there was be like this timed day. And, you know, our friends and my friends who worked in those spaces were in the hazmat suits and doing the whole thing. And I always said, like, what happened after the cheering stopped? You know, those clients of mine were in doing work with their relationships with their partners for their children. And now all of a sudden you throw COVID on top of that, all the people. And it wasn't just the nurses, right? You talk about the teachers. Teachers had to reorient classrooms. They had to be working with kids while all of this is happening. And so now they're layers upon layers upon layers of what they've seen and experienced, what they've absorbed, what their brains have been exposed to, just all of it. And then they'd come to a session and I can't, we got to clear what you just saw today. Forget about what's happened at your home right now, because your nervous system is so dysregulated from your day that I got to help stabilize you first before we can attend to anything else.
Oh, I feel that big time. I think maybe you're on here because you're talking directly to me, because it's true. And educators every day go home, and a lot of times, you know, I even think about, I came home and I used to talk about things with my spouse, and she is an engineer. She's not into education, and kids, not her jam except for ours. But anyway, but I would come home and I'd be like, and she finally just said, is there any day that something doesn't happen? Yeah. And I'm like, you know, now that you say that, although I have to say, nothing happened today. It was a smooth day, but some days you just carry it and it's just what you do. But that isn't the healthy way, right? It isn't the being the best version of yourself, because we can't just carry it. Vicarious trauma, and I'm going to ask you if you could give just a little bit of a definition for those people who do not know the idea of vicarious trauma. I know I'm very familiar with it, but how do you describe that to people when you say, man, people and everywhere, whether you work in a department store or you're working at a local restaurant? I waited tables. It was traumatic sometimes. People were incredibly unkind. But how do you describe, or how would you define vicarious trauma?
Well, I always like to tell people that vicarious trauma is not the trauma happening to you, but you're witnessing something happening to another. And so many times I hear people, someone just said this to me last Friday. She said, well, I haven't had a lot of trauma in my life, but there was this one time where I watched my friend go through this thing. And I'm like, yeah, that's trauma. That's vicarious trauma. And exactly what you just said, we witness fender benders or car accidents on the daily. We witness, we don't have the same type of gun stuff that you guys have over there. So I can't even imagine, because a really close friend of mine talks to me about the things that she's experienced throughout her life. And I'm like, we got to tap that out. Like, you're holding all that stuff. And it's even just watching the news of it. So like the event happens, but then it's what's reported on the news, what's reported on social media, what's reported by your friend's experience of it. And I think I want to go back to what you said, because my mom was a principal. My grandmother was a guidance counselor. And when I think about watching them always in action, they didn't say to me, you have to go out in the world and be me. But I watched them do that. And so here's the thing about it, that brains, when they're developing, do not need to be told something. You just need to observe the thing. And if your brain does not have an adult with the mentalization to help you explain what's happening, that brain will decide how that story goes and then imprint it. That, I think, is something that I really am trying to help people understand, because lots of times people can say, well, my parents were really great. They really supported me. They really loved me. They like did all these things for me. And I'm like, yeah, that can be true. And we could have seen things where our parents weren't able to process grief. We saw them push it down. We saw them not cry when there should have been tears for that sad thing. And as a brain that's developing in the world, if we use something as simple as somebody passing, right? If I see as a little girl that somebody's passed away and then nobody's crying about it and everyone's fine and we just keep moving, it doesn't make sense. My intuitive sense is something sad's here and nobody's crying about it. Why is that happening? And then imprint, okay, well, I guess I'm not supposed to cry when something sad happens because nobody else did that. There must be a reason for that. And so when you talk about educators, you talk about showing up and having to hold all this stuff. The kids are watching them hold all the stuff. They're watching them power through it. They're keenly observing how they're navigating their day. They're watching how they navigate the kids' stress responses in the classroom, all the things. And so we don't have to explicitly say, you do this, you do this, you do this. Because I would say for me, a lot of what was imprinted, what I had to unlearn, were not things that were explicitly said to me. They were things I observed.
Well, and it even comes down to the science of stress contagion, right? And I talk to teachers all the time about stress contagion. If you are overwhelmed stress, it is contagious. Kids, we as human beings, right? We sense this instability. If I always say, if you ever experience a professional sporting event, stress contagion, and it's good and bad, right? And it's emotional contagion.
So good.
If I'm a huge soccer fan, we go to Nashville SC, which we won last weekend. We go to games. We have season tickets, and when the momentum is going, you can feel it, right? The same happens in a classroom when a teacher is completely buried themselves in overwhelm. Kids can feel it. We have in the school that I lead now and my previous school, we have a tap in and tap out protocol, which is if you're feeling overwhelmed, you go to our communication app that we use and we just say, I need to tap out. It's a channel. I need to tap out. And that is to recognize, but first of all, adults have to recognize, humans have to recognize, I have a feeling, I have these emotions right now. I have these feelings coming into my body and I need to do something. That is a skill in itself that I've learned a lot of people don't have. They don't have the recognizing cue to say, man, I'm not okay right now. Like my hands I feel a tightness in my hands, or I feel it in my chest, or my feet, I feel like stomping, or I feel that bubbling up in my head, or my ears get red when I get super overwhelmed. So I'm like, they don't have that. So we have to teach not just the kids, because it's very important that we teach the kids, but as adults, we have to model. That is part of the co-regulatory process of my calm needs to breed your calm. So if you're dysregulated as a child, bringing the heat into that situation is not going to calm the child. Bringing the calm, validating, recognizing, acknowledging, I don't know how many times I've said this, kid, I see you look like you're really frustrated. Is that right? Give me a thumbs up if you're comfortable with that. And they'll tell me, I'll tell you what, I'm going to sit right here. When you're ready, you can either come over, give me thumbs up, you can sit by me, whatever you want, but I'm going to be right here whenever you're ready. Those are skills that we're not taught in teacher school, right? And from a therapeutic standpoint, I've had to learn that because that's what we have to do to kids. Because when we grew up, it was compliance. You suck it up, you be quiet, you sit down, and you do what you're told. There is still a mindset that floats around out there that has that same exact thing. Who cares what the kid is dealing with? They need to come to school and be quiet and sit down.
Yeah. Well, and when I add on to that layer in sport, right, it was like, oh, you're hurt, you're fine. You fell off your bike, you're bleeding, you're fine. That's good. And so I learned from a very young age, that 11-year-old sport trauma, I learned because my mom had hired a sports psychologist who helped me try and work through it. I just learned to leave my body. My brain was saying danger, danger, danger. And every time I dove into the water, and so just like it's a really small example, but it's a good one, because I was at a competition, dove into the water, swallowed water and choked on it, came up in the middle of the routine, coughing and vomiting, managed to get myself back into the routine. Super proud of myself for doing that, by the way. And then after the routine was done, I was publicly shamed, screamed at by my coach in front of an entire aquatic arena of divers coaches. You're 11 years old as a young girl, like you care about what people think. And that moment was traumatizing because, one, I felt like my coach didn't trust that I could do it. Two, my body now was having this response that every time I went back in, I literally would feel my lungs like this, and so when I worked with the sports psych, yeah, he helped me practice bringing my breathing down. He helped me regulate, but my brain was planted with this trauma. It literally screamed every single competition I ever competed, even as a master athlete, extreme stress going to the competition. And all I could think about was just get it over with, just get it over with. And that get it over with is what I entered into speaking engagements with, into every single thing. I would start to feel the stress, and all I wanted was for it to be over. There was no enjoyment or pleasure in anything I did because that seed was flashing off. Now, when I learned that you can't outthink it and you can't outtalk it, and that trauma had been planted, I saw how I spent then all 2 decades trying to prove myself in every coach that existed, as a swimmer and as a coach. And that's wild to me, because now that I've reprocessed all of that, I get to go in spaces and like genuinely love what I'm talking about. I get to go in and my body feels safe to be in these places because, like what you said, I only ever learned to leave my body. I learned to follow procedure. I learned to follow this like order of things, and it was always stressful and it was always constricting, you know?
And I think in schools that's very common, right? Is that push in every aspect of school, in sports as well. I mean, I don't think that leaves at any point in education. You when I did your introduction, we talked about EMDR, and before we came on and began to record, I told you I got the incomprehensible. I'm so grateful for the experience of going through EMDR, not personally, but with an attachment of someone that we supported, and got to go through the process with them, and just saw the power of EMDR. And if you paid me $1 million right now, I know it's there's rapid eye something or other. Desensitive to something. I never can say what it is. But if you could give us a little intro into EMDR, and I have had one other therapist on here about EMDR, and then take us to this idea of EMDR assist, which is the process that you work with people through. Because I think when people hear it, they're going to go, that's something that I think I might need, right? Because that reset is so important. But give us a little overview of EMDR, and then tell us a little bit about assist.
Okay. So it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it basically helps you understand that, our brain is divided. We have a right and left hemisphere. When we experience a stressful or traumatic experience, and it doesn't have to be, a traumatic thing to one person. It's how the body imprints. So when we experience this brain imprinting, it gets stuck in this right hemisphere of our brain. And like I said before, you can't outtalk it, you can't outthink it. Now, EMDR uses eye movement, which when we sleep at night and we go into REM sleep, our eyes move from right to left. That's our brain's way of trying to process the day's events naturally. But when our brain experiences trauma, it can't process it by itself because it gets snagged. So kids who grew up in the 90s, I always say, we had the CD and it's be skipping. It's like that. Your brain will start looping. And so what it does there's different variations for how you can do EMDR. Either you follow a light bar, you can listen in your ears, you can hold these paddles, or you can tap with bilateral tapping on your arms or on your legs. Your eyes are closed in those cases. And so what you do is you work with a practitioner to select a target. So if we use me as an example, my 11-year-old moment, if I closed my eyes, I could see the image of that moment in time for me. That would be my target. And what happens is we then desensitize. If mine was, it always goes on a scale from 0 to 10. When I close my eyes and see that target, it's a 10. And when we tap with the target, there's timed intervals that you tap. Your brain starts to input information that it didn't have at that trauma because it was stuck. So I always say to people, these moments, we get stuck and frozen in trauma time, and you cannot see the big picture. You only see the piece of it that your brain has held. So for me, I saw the diving mats that I sat on. I could smell the chlorine. This is 2 decades later. I could smell the chlorine in my nose. I could feel the texture of the diving mats that I was sitting on, and I could feel the heat of the room. Like all of that came back, but I didn't have to talk about it without my body being desensitized. So eventually you get from a 10 out of 10, if that's how distressing mine was, and it gets to a 0. Now, the best part of EMDR, which not a lot of people, if they don't stay in it long enough, they don't get to the best part, which is installing the positive cognition. So for me, my negative cognition was I'm not good enough. And there is a whole list of negative cognitions that connect, right? Things like I'm stupid, I'm not lovable, I'm helpless, I'm not in control, all these kinds of cognitions. And so once you clear that negative cognition, then you get to install the positive cognition, which is actually, I am good enough. That moment had nothing to do with me, actually. My coach's response was based off of I'm very confident of how she was treated as an athlete in the world, because this is how trauma gets passed down, right? She would have been screamed at also, and she would have been screamed at by the superiors in the 90s, right? Because we all followed this thing. And then once I realized like it wasn't about me and I am good enough, then the last step is we clear the body. And so we know body keeps the score. And so where in our body? Well, I was holding all this in my chest and my sternum and my solar plexus. And then we clear that trauma out of our body. Now that's no longer activating in me. So I can tell you the story of what happened. I can see it, but there's no charge happening here. It's gone, right? So there's spaciousness between me, the event, my coach, and everybody there. I don't share the story because I want to bring blame to that moment, but that moment of being there impacted my life. And I know I'm not alone in that. Like I know that there's many, many people who have been impacted too. So part of it is to say that I can share this and not be taken out by it. 6 years ago, I couldn't even talk to you about it without just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. And so that's a standard protocol for EMDR. And we usually do an intake and we'll collect history from people and we'll start to understand attachment, because attachment's really important, right? What did your attachment look like, especially in the 0 to 13 age range? And then we also want to measure levels of dissociation. So what people kind of share about being zoned out or, I was just like tuned out for a minute, that's dissociation. And our levels of dissociation are depending on how in tune we are to our body. So if like me, we have to leave our body, my levels of dissociation were very high because I would leave my body. And once I got trained in EMDR, and then started to bring it into my practice, all my high performers, when they got the form, guess what? They were all high levels of dissociation. And so this is a wild thing, because my trainer, the woman who trained me in EMDR, she was like, well, if you have clients that are moderate to high dissociation, you have to do advanced training. So now I had to go and do more training to work with the people like me. And so that was so important. Because sometimes I'll run into people and they'll say, oh yeah, I tried EMDR, it didn't work. I'm like, yeah, okay. And in my head, I'm like, I know why. Because when we have high levels of dissociation, there are going to be parts of us, like these protector resistant parts that are like, I've operated in the world for long enough. I've had success with it. I'm not going to go back and relive that stuff. Like, no, thank you. And so it shows up to want to block it. And so I always say, and I like to share this because you can get trained and do the EMDR and it's amazing. And there's lots of amazing people that are out there doing it. And also you have to, like, the training to do it has evolved so much that there's so many courses now on all sorts of different things. So I like to say that in case people are listening and they're like, oh, I tried, it didn't work for me. I'd say find someone who's done some advanced training, because that really does make a difference. And then the assist. So when I got trained in the group protocol, what I learned was that we have 90 days to clear and process stress or trauma before it imprints. 90 days. So that was wild because, like, you know, I spent all my life avoiding. So then you're thinking, holy crap, how much am I holding in here? And if you can process it within 90 days, your chances of it integrating into chronic anxiety or PTSD significantly decrease. So the assist protocol and these group protocols that I got trained in are nonverbal. There's no talking. Now, this was key because all my high performers, and if you asked me to show up in a group space and start talking about the things that were hard, there's no way that I would have showed up in those spaces. And all my male athletes were like, yeah, no, that's not happening. And so I had a client actually who was an elite athlete and now business human, and said to me, well, figure out how to do it anonymously. Now, I told you at the beginning of the show, I'm a rule follower. So I wasn't trained in thinking outside the box. I was trained in, you do this protocol on Zoom, everyone sees each other, you bring in the space. And he was like, no, you can do this anonymously. So that was another part of my journey of, okay, how do I do that? Well, you know, Zoom had it figured out because teachers had to figure out how to, you know, run these sessions without kids being distracted, looking at each other. So there's this private mode that happens. People can come into the space. They see me as the therapist, but they can't see anyone else. Amazing, right? And then when they're the nonverbal piece of it is like, just like me, the shame that I would have felt with sort of opening things up, you know, the embarrassment or like this feeling of like, well, I just can't really hack it. Like in my mind, I was hacking it. I was holding, I was doing the thing. So to admit that, like, I'm not doing that, you would have never had me in a group space either. 100%, I wouldn't have shown up there, because also that moment for me at 11 showed me group spaces aren't safe, showed me someone's not going to have my back. And it showed me that there was major betrayal in that moment for me, where this was somebody I loved and really respected and looked up to, and she broke that. And so I never entered a group space again feeling safe ever until I did the reprocessing. And so part of me coming into the world is recognizing lots of people have had, you know, situations where they've also been in group spaces and it hasn't been safe, and or in therapy places where it hasn't been safe. And so when you can reprocess with the assist, nonverbal, and nobody sees you, I'm just guiding you and you get to do the tapping, you know? And so it's a beautiful thing because people come in, you know, if we were to take your week and we run a mental movie of the last, I mean, we say the last 90 days. So we're going to run a movie of the last 90 days. You're going to find the thing that felt the most stressful or traumatic that's happened. We're going to tap it. We're going to help regulate your nervous system and stabilize it. And once we do that, then there's this consciousness, this aha moment that comes that says, oh, and so everyone that's come and done my assist then wants more because they go, holy crap, I'm holding a lot. Holy crap, like I need to do something with this thing that actually is creating suffering in my life. And so then we go into the step 2 of the offering, which is now creating groups where there's a general target, but can also be reprocessed without talking. So we use art therapy to do that in a virtual space. And so, you know, things like burnout, you know, people who want to come there, we have one in April that we're running. And, you know, for people who are experiencing burnout, like it doesn't have to be the same. What's burnout for you and burnout for me and burnout for someone else, it's going to be different, but you don't need to tell me what yours is about. I'm going to hold space. I'm going to help you process that. I'm going to help you put it down. But I don't need to know your story. When you're ready to tell your story, if you want to, you can do it in a way that's going to feel safe for your nervous system so that you can come into the world and share that, or not, or you just hold it and it's a private thing for you. But you're not sort of forced to do that, you know?
Yeah. And, I think about this as an opportunity, and we're getting close to that very end of time. And I know I told you time would go really quickly, but if people want to join these sessions or they want to learn more, where can they find you? How can they get the information? Because I think about this, even, man, my brain constantly runs wild, but I'm thinking, I can imagine doing this once a month with all staff virtually and nobody there. You don't have to look, but we're all going to process, because even this year, there has been some pretty incomprehensible things. We have lost a parent to cancer. We have actually 2 parents to cancer. We have had situations in our community. We had a school shooting here in Nashville just a few months ago. There's been so much that if we had the opportunity, right, for my school to go through this together monthly as an opportunity to just let's ground, let's process, let's get this through. And so we can show up for ourselves first, right? Then each other and the kids. If we can do this, that would be incredible. So how do they learn more? How can they get a hold of you? What does that sound like?
Yeah. So it's shiftchange.life is our website, and there's a booking link. So right now we offer the assist every week. The goal was for it to be like a yoga class. You just sign in, and, as those get more busy and there's more times that, people need, because there's going to be varying time zones and stuff like that, then we just plug them in. We've been lucky that lots of what you said, lots of companies and corporations have, they buy a time slot, and then their people get to come and process it. And so either way, there's a contact page on the website if people want to reach out and they're curious about how do they bring their people in. You and I were talking about offering peer support and supervision and all that kind of stuff, right? I think that when people have the space to process first what they're holding, then they can decide if they want to share something about it. And oftentimes, if we're holding shame or we feel embarrassed or we feel guilty, like if we can process that and help put it down, and our brain helps us go, oh, you know what? That wasn't really like as big as I had maybe thought it was, because now the brain's integrating it. Then we can come back into spaces and just be so much more grounded, stabilized, mindful of what we're sharing. It's really, to me, it's my sort of offer to the world of how do we make change and how do we bring impact. And it starts here first, and then we can go out.
Oh, absolutely. And that's 100%. And I think I hear all the time, kids need to do this, kids need to do that. And my response is always, no, we need to.
Yes.
It needs to start with us. And then we can,
yes.
Then we can process that. So very quickly, in a few sentences, if you don't mind, what do you want educators to know from Kara Kalin right now?
I just want you to know that all the things that you've been holding and that you have held, that you also are worthy of being held to. Yeah.
And on that note, you all, thank you, Kara, for being on here. Thank you all for listening. And hey, if you have not checked out the book, Reducing Stress in Schools by yours truly and 4 other remarkable authors, Ingrid Cochran, Dr. Taisha Noyes, Julie Kurtz, and Dr. Julie Nicholson. Check it out, because we talk about all of these things in the context of school, for one. And also, if you don't follow the Unapologetic Disruptor on social media, please do that. And also, you can also join 92,586 people and follow the Trauma Informed Educators Network, as we are growing by leaps and bounds and connecting people, sharing tons of resources. And then lastly, make sure you join our group, the Trauma Informed Educators Network group. I think it's 34,000 people from, again, over 100 countries. So join us, like us, and please leave a review for the podcast. I've talked about it every time. It's how we move our way up so people can learn more about the work that we all are putting in the world. So thank you. And as always, please, please, please go out into the world and just do something awesome. All right. Thank you. I didn't have anybody put any comments in that I saw. Oh, yes, I did. Oh, my goodness. Felicia, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. And thank you for being a listener live with us. We do appreciate when people jump in and join us. So thank you. And I do not have my next podcast scheduled. My hope is not next week, but the following week. I've got several people that I am ready to line up to have on here. So thank you for being listeners. Thank you for joining us live, and we will see you soon.